name is Ross Sawyers. I'm the chair of the photography department at Columbia College Chicago, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the second installment of the Lectures in Photography series for the fall of 2020. The Lectures in Photography series is co-presented by the Museum of Contemporary Photography and the photography department at Columbia College Chicago. The third and final installment for the fall series will feature Mimi Plum on December 2nd at 6 o'clock. And we hope all of you will be able to join us again then. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to take a quick moment to thank Natasha Egan, Karen Irvine, Kristen Taylor, and the rest of the staff at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. This lecture series would not be possible without their support. I also want to take a moment to thank Kelly Connell, the graduate program director in the photography department. Her behind the scenes work on this lecture series is invaluable. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Kristine Potter. Kristine's work explores masculine archetypes, the American landscape, and cultural tendencies toward mythologizing the past. Her previous work has focused on young male military cadets and the relentless danger of the American West. This work attempts to reframe the mythology of indomitable men and explore the bleed between human violence and natural threat. Her current work investigates a feedback loop between nature and myth, how a threatening landscape primes a culture for violence and a violent culture projects threat onto a landscape. Potter received an MFA in photography from Yale University in 2005. She's a 2018 Guggenheim Fellow and is the current awardee of the Grand Prix Images Vevey. Her first monograph, Manifest, was published by TBW Books in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Kristine Potter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the Museum of Contemporary Photography and the photography department at Columbia College, Chicago, for having me today. I'm delighted to be here, even if it's in Zoom land, and I do really look forward to meeting with graduate students on Friday. I can't wait to see what you're doing. I'm going to share my screen here and get started.
Kristine, I'm sorry, can I jump in real quick before you get started?
Sure.
I forgot one very important thing. I'll be managing the Q&A section following Kristine's lecture. If you have questions at any point throughout the lecture tonight, please feel free to post them in the Q&A. And then following the lecture, I will manage those questions with Kristine. So there you go, Kristine. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Ross. And I let everyone know I'm happy to stick around as long as you guys want to chat. So I'll try to make this around 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. So again, thank you for being here. I'll get right to it. So tonight I'm going to talk about 3 bodies of work. And I'll begin with some biographical context, which is kind of important. I grew up a military brat who had the uncommon experience of growing up primarily in one place, Central Georgia, in a military town. I studied art history and photography at the University of Georgia, spent a few years in Paris working as a professional printer, and then I came back to the States to earn a master's degree in photography at Yale in 2005. After that, I spent about 12 years in New York City, the home base from which I produced most of the work I'm going to show you today. I'm now living in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've been here about 3 years, so some of what you'll see is being produced more regionally in the Southeast. The first body of work I'm going to share with you today is from my series, The Gray Line, made between the years of 2005 and 2010. These are a series of portraits made of West Point cadets situated in natural, often bucolic environments. I started the work at the height of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and shot entirely on the campus of West Point, the Army's military academy in upstate New York. Growing up in a family so deeply entrenched in the military eventually caused me to want to reflect on both its pervasive patriarchal structure and the ways in which we have traditionally viewed soldiers and officers. I chose West Point as a site because it has familial significance. Here you'll see my father and his brother who attended in the late 1960s, but also because it was a place that cultivated ranking officers over the course of 4 years. It is a place where my father told me, quote, "Boys are turned into men." It's key to remember that the group of cadets I photographed in the early 2000s were the first in over 30 years to know that upon graduation, they'd almost certainly be sent to war. For decades prior, they mostly went off to peacekeeping missions or gained rank on European posts. Much like these two you see here who went to Vietnam, college was also going to serve as a training site for war. My father and uncle are not the only military men in my family. There are many, all the way up the family tree, all the way back to the American Revolution. And photos and paintings in my home look like this: stern, stable, decorated, powerful. This is one of my grandfathers. And this is a great-grandfather, an Army officer who commanded the 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division during World War II. Here he is again. This is my great-grandfather there in the middle, General Harry J. Collins, as he was greeting his troops in Austria after liberating one of several concentration camps. He went on to become the acting military governor of Austria until after the war. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that my home was filled with images of readiness, honor, valor, and sternness. But there's historical examples of military men being depicted outside of that kind of necessary readiness I knew from my family photos. And these exceptions live in very specific visual spaces. The photographs of Matthew Brady are particularly interesting to me, taken on the periphery of Civil War with a camera that necessitated a certain stillness in the sitter. His pictures revealed something of the more engaged, less projected state of the soldier's life. Here, an injury on the sidelines, or the camps outside the battle lines. I'm interested in these pictures as descriptions of war that are not primed for positing strength or fortitude, but rather of their vulnerabilities, their need for rest, or even a kind of jovial camaraderie in the face of horrific daily battles. I found some half-frame 35mm slides stored deep in a closet in my home. These were taken by my father during his deployment in Vietnam. These pictures, or at least the ones that really interested me, showed bodies embedded deep in a jungle, lying down, obscured. The images seem more holistically about the experience of being a soldier. This one and this one too, you see my father's knees in the bottom of the frame there. He's also laying down in the jungle. So I decided I wanted to look at the institution that sought to turn boys into the kind of men I've been showing you. I spent about a year writing letters to the PR department at West Point to try to gain legitimate permission to make photos on post, but was consistently declined. So I decided to just go in anyways as a tourist, albeit with a fancier than average camera. This is actually the first cadet that I photographed, whom I solicited by explaining to him that I had numerous men in my family who either attended West Point or had otherwise held a high ranking in the Army. I explained to him I was interested in making portraits that spoke more directly to their individuality of experience. I told him I wanted to see cadets outside of the Corps in a more human way. I didn't think this picture was particularly successful yet. I was still trying to figure out just how I wanted to look at them, but I did find out, and I'm not kidding, that we grew up in the same town and that my father had actually recruited him to West Point. So I took it as a sign that I was on the right path, and he took it as a sign, I think, that he could trust me. At the time, I was reading a lot of Carl Jung, and I was particularly interested in the writings about the four archetypes of man: the king, the warrior, the lover, and the magician. A close reading of Jung's four archetypes of mature masculinity draws attention to boy psychology and man psychology. For the sake of time, I can't go too deep into the constructs, but I did find it to be an interesting jumping off point for thinking about the path from high school teenager to officer in the military. How did my father, uncles, grandfathers, etc., become who I knew them to be? Were the hardened portraits of them the truth of who they were on the battlefield, or a projection? Were the steely stares of my father and uncle in the picture you saw earlier a kind of play acting? Just when does a boy become a soldier? And what are the shifting attributes? And furthermore, were those attributes of the mature masculine soldier inherent or learned? Word of mouth would lead me from one subject to the next over the course of the next 5 years. And with each cadet, I'd spend time talking with them about their experience, their ideas surrounding their chosen path. And remarkably, they were quite generous with their thoughts, that they were excited and apprehensive at the same time, that they were honored to eventually serve their country, but a little unsure of the mission. Here you can see what appears, someone who appears to have one arm missing. It's not true, of course, it's just how it appears in the photo. It's just an illusion, but I see it as a possibly predictive pose. And I was aware of these gestures and illusions, and I kept them in the edit as a way to explore notions of honor and loss. What I saw at the time were adolescents hovering between boyhood and manhood. They were hovering between being civilian and being officer, and they hovered between their lives as individuals and their collective life as core. And they often hovered between trained, hardened expression and one that held all the thoughts, feelings, and emotions you could imagine might fill one's mind if their chosen profession listed death as a daily job hazard. This pose was actually suggested somehow between the cadet and myself. He told me that he had certainly considered death before. He had even rehearsed it in a way. This work went on to have several exhibitions and positive critical review out of the New York art world. It wasn't until a few years later when BuzzFeed published them without much context that these pictures were viewed by over 250,000 people in just one day, leading to a tidal wave of internet comments about how the cadets were posed. There were accusations that I had made them look, quote, weak or feminine or otherwise not manly enough. It got me thinking about gender performativity and just what rules felt unbendable. In her writings about gender, Judith Butler tells us, quote, the appearance of substance is precisely that, a constructed identity, a performative accomplishment, which the mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and perform in the mode of belief. The loudest viewers of these pictures on BuzzFeed believe that I had manipulated these men out of the warrior's natural and dutiful expressions. Vulnerable gestures and psychologies couldn't, or perhaps shouldn't, exist in them. The entire situation highlighted for me the exact issue I sought to reconcile, that men in this culture are afforded a very narrow spectrum of acceptable masculine behavior. Something like guy shows just nuanced gesture or emotion equals guy must be girly or gay equals weak. You can see the problem in that line of thought. I should mention here that many of these cadets came to my defense when the internet trolls were hammering away, but a few of them felt disappointed by the experience, which of course made me immediately defensive on their behalf. I didn't want to put my art career ahead of their feelings. So I asked BuzzFeed to remove the images, and while they assured me that this was deeply contrary to their journalistic mission, they did finally remove the pictures. A few years later, Lightwork in Syracuse, New York, asked if I'd mount an exhibition and produce a catalog of the work. Honestly, I was hesitant, but I thought, well, here's an opportunity to bring them off the screen and into a space where they can be more adequately contextualized, redeemed. So I decided to make an extra large print edition of each being 40 by 50 inches, quite a bit larger than they had been exhibited before, hoping to make them feel more monumental. In many cases, the figures became larger than life size, something I typically don't do, making their presence in the room more imposing and sculptural. I was asked recently in the Photo Works book that was recently published by Aperture and edited by Sasha Wolf if I had ever re-edited a series after an initial exhibition or publication. This is an example where I have, and I believe the larger scale not only works better, but it reflects the history of the image itself. It's an evolution, if you will. As an added point of context, I printed some of my father's pictures from Vietnam. I turned them black and white. I printed them roughly 20 by 25, showing the men in the field exhibiting many of the same expressions and gestures and body positions of my cadets. I'll end here, this series anyways, with just a few more images before I move on. Here's a portrait I hope spoke to what I imagined was in part the complexities of contemporary military service, the management of violence ostensibly for good, and the confusion of our new wars where soldiers must suss out the difference between allies and enemies when they look exactly the same. The abstraction of camouflage and the notion of hiding oneself. The practice of combat and notions of ephemerality. This was a pretty pivotal picture for me and one of those wonderful photographic surprises where the result is far better than the intention. The way the bodies disappear into the landscape still feels like an idea that I'm exploring even today. And finally, and I'll just touch on this briefly, I was interested in the warrior as a kind of coded violence inside the landscape. This was the last photograph I took at West Point and suitably includes two soldiers walking away from me back into the landscape from whence they came. There was a giant helicopter hovering over. It was so loud, I felt like we were, you know, just dropped off in the middle of nowhere. Seemed appropriate somehow. In about 2012, after wrapping up the work on West Point, I wanted to pivot to another archetype of American masculinity, and I thought rather immediately of the cowboy. At that time, I had been helping my folks archive some ephemera we inherited from my great-great-grandparents, who were some of the first performers in the touring Wild West shows of the late 19th century. These are my great-great-grandparents, Little Annie Sure Shot and Wild Bert. They were sharpshooters who toured those shows, both Buffalo Bill shows and also their own shows, and I think who helped cultivate the mythology of the American West. This is just some examples of the news clippings this is from 1896. A detail here says, "From the far off Wild West will appear in the bright trappings of the nomadic plainsmen with their saddles, bridles, rifles, pistols, revolvers, knives, and lariats, presenting perfect representations of the habits, customs, pursuits, and avocations of those semi-civilized inhabitants of the boundless prairie, an exhibition instructive to the children and pleasing to the ladies." I was pretty taken by the language used in several of these show announcements. In Gunfighter Nation, Richard Slotkin argues that Theodore Roosevelt, along with others, helped create a mythological frontier. Instead of understanding the American West as a region with history, Slotkin argues it became an ideological staging ground for the battle of good versus evil, civilization versus savagery. In 1893, the frontier was no longer a geographical place whose history the settlers bothered to understand. Its signification as a mythic space began to outweigh its importance as a real place. I'd argue the tours of the Wild West shows that traversed the eastern US and Europe were equally influential in establishing the settlement of the West as storied and entertaining. It's important to remember that the advent of photography aligns perfectly with our invention of the West. Survey photographers such as Carlton Watkins and Timothy O'Sullivan helped us see the West as vast and glorious. These photographs framed the West as heroic, expansive, and receptive territory. They were meant to show the riches of newly acquired land, and I see them as vista view repositories for our dreams and aspirations as a nation. Here's Timothy O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins. Sandra Phillips tells us that in the era of manifest destiny, attitudes towards the West were expressed in a language of control, and that subsequently nature was in need of taming, for she was wild, virgin, and often dark, thus needed to be penetrated and controlled. Stanley Walakau Wanambwa extends these ideas in an essay he wrote in my book when he writes, "The American West was thus a gendered terrain, subject to the masculine imperative of national expansion. Its capture was properly the duty of what Theodore Roosevelt described as, quote, men winnowed out from among the nations of the old world by the energy, boldness, and love of adventure found in their own eager hearts." So what can we say about some of our most iconic American cowboys, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood? Max Westbrook describes Wayne as our #1 tough guy, big-hearted, all-American Hollywood hero. In a majority of movies he made throughout his career, Wayne epitomized what Americans preferred to see as their national image throughout the world. The take no prisoners, tough, strong, courageous, honorable man who stood up to evil and ultimately won against it. He had to have filled some need in his audience. He stood for an America that people felt was disappearing or had disappeared, for a time when men were men. At Wayne's death, President Jimmy Carter stated, "John Wayne was a symbol of many of the most basic qualities that made America great. The ruggedness, the tough independence, the sense of personal conviction and courage, on and off the screen, reflected the best of our national character." So this brings me to my photographs. After a couple trips out west, my ideas really clarified. I sought to do two things. Re-envision the terrain of the American West as different than the pictorial record suggests, and to similarly construct an account of masculinities that revised the conventions. I wanted to refashion the self in its relation to the land, to offer them as crucibles for the emergence of new possibilities for subjectivity and emotional embodiment. I'll say something here about the ways in which I produce work. First, I don't go out to necessarily illustrate these or any ideas. The architecture of any given project is necessarily loose at the outset, and it becomes more specific through editing and reflection. When I started, I didn't know how I was going to respond to the landscape. I didn't know who I was going to meet, and I didn't know how it was going to come together. I will say that these first two pictures I've shown you open my book. It's an inversion of the typical scene setting photo that brings you into a story. Instead, I give you a man, splayed, open, receptive, and a landscape that mirrors his invitation. Of course, once engaged, the situation becomes much more complicated. A few notes about process here. I shoot primarily with a large format view camera. That's me. It's a slow, methodical way of looking, and it bears significant effect on the nature of the picture making experience as well as on the final product. When making portraits, there's no doubt that the camera provides a kind of special seriousness to an occasion that's more often experienced these days pretty nonchalantly and with an iPhone. It was in this project that I also started to carry a DSLR with me, mostly as a way to take notes, really, at the beginning, but sometimes I'd come back to edit and realize the successes in those looser handheld pictures. So I let go of the rules I had built for myself about what kind of camera was the serious camera that I had to exclusively use for my serious work, and that's been a really good transition for me, so I use both. Either way, I'm beginning the editing process with a color file. That's obviously true with raw images, but surprising to some people, I actually purposefully shoot on color film and digitally convert it into black and white before printing it with ink on paper. The reason for this has to do with the control I have over the translation from color to grayscale. For example, most of these landscape pictures I'm going to show you would look very different if they were captured on black and white film. And part of what I'm doing in the translation is I'm pulling colors up or I'm pushing them back on that monochromatic scale in a way that creates a kind of abstraction or disoriented feeling. I don't want the pictures to like scream that they, have been manipulated or are weird, as much as I want the viewer, when encountering the work, to feel like something is slightly off. This space is odd, uncanny. Here's one interpretation from color to black and white, and here is another. Here's one, and another. And I make tons of these in my studio as I work. There might be 20 different interpretations sitting on my wall, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the right one. The truth of the matter is that being there was actually disorienting for me. It's that experience that helped me to begin to understand how I was going to photograph the landscape. I was typically shooting at an altitude between 7,000 and 9,000 feet above sea level. And for someone who's commuted from literally sea level, like New York City sea level, it was a challenging environment. I'd become lightheaded, get nosebleeds, become short of breath, or otherwise wrestle with what I felt was a kind of glorious yet hostile environment. My operating questions became, could I make pictures that relayed that feeling? And could I make pictures that push the viewer into the experience of the landscape rather than allowing them to comfortably view it from the outside? You might notice there are no vista views here, no big sky landscapes, no mountain ranges in the accessible distance. I've tilted the frame, I've gone lengths to confuse scale, and otherwise created landscapes that, while hopefully beautiful, are also abstract, dangerous, and disallow the viewer the satisfaction of the big sky, big mountain, Western motif. The portraits came slower. It was really a matter of meeting a few people who would introduce me to more and so on. The area is so remote and people live in far-flung ranches, yurts, or farms, or they're otherwise totally itinerant. I had a clearer idea of what's possible with portraits generally, though each man I met was different and the conditions were entirely opposite than shooting inside the structured walls of West Point. I was often far outside of cell phone range by myself, trying to make pictures of men I barely knew, who were almost certainly armed, hoping that somewhere between my spidey senses and human decency, it would work out. This is Topher, and this is actually the very first portrait I made out there. He became something of my photographic muse during the project, a real cowboy who'd regularly tell me he was born 100 years too late. I photographed him every time I went back. My sessions with these men can last anywhere from a few minutes to an hour or more. It really depends on the vibe, their willingness, and my perception of whether we're getting somewhere increasingly revelatory or not. I'm looking for expressions that are authentic and communicative. I'm also looking for ways to complicate the figure-ground relationship. I was looking to make pictures that told me something about the larger circumstance of living in near isolation, and pictures that tell me something of how they feel being photographed by me. This is Maya, who lived in this particular summer. He lived in a teepee on the side of a mountain. There was this amazing 15-minute window where the sun would come beaming in the backside of his teepee, creating a kind of light box. We tried for days to get it right, which usually meant me showing up, having everything set up, and him not showing up. But finally, on day 4 or 5, we got it. I thought a lot about how to build landscape pictures that felt different. It wasn't just that my, quote, feminine gaze might see it differently, but it was actually that I saw the landscape as a feminine energy. If the West was originally seen as controllable, exploitable place, then I wanted to complicate that notion. I wanted to make landscape pictures that didn't feel easily read or digested, or I otherwise wanted to create some visual chaos. And I think that's more to the natural order of things, actually. This area is not easily restrained, and I didn't like the idea that it was often, though not exclusively, seen as a site for domination. One of the men I met out there turned out to be something of the area's resident intellectual. Books piled floor to ceiling. He told me he liked to write stories. I'd asked if he'd be interested in writing something atmospheric about the region, something about being a man in the mountain desert, about why people ended up there. Nearly a year after our conversation, I received a long, disjointed, and totally remarkable piece of prose or poetry. I'll finish moving through some of these images while reading a little bit of what he wrote. This is not him, by the way. I don't like to reveal his picture because I prefer his words when they feel as though they could come from any of these characters, or maybe all of them exist in a single psyche. I wrestled with including this writing in my book and decided not to do so, but I do like the experience of hearing them while viewing the pictures. The writer's name is Naropa Sabine. I'm not a killer, he said. If I am, we all are. I'm just trying to have a life. No one knows who he was talking to, but that didn't matter. At least he was talking. People say a lot, too little, then too much. Who really knows why we bleed? Cornered, back against the wall, burned under a bad sign, full moon about to burst, bent in a bend of a river under a snarl of tooth and rough hand. What a face he has, or maybe it's just what's under it, just like everyone else's until you look. A fence trying to hold something in. Something that leaves like a night wind. It comes, it goes, a rustle in the branches, a piece of dry land, an abandoned house, railroad tracks to the mine, a face always slightly turned to the past, cracked and patched by the past. I never wanted to hurt nobody, just scratch something out of this place, this valley, eat some fruit, pull it fresh off the limb, just like Adam, the first man. We know what happened to him, though. Does any good thing last? It had gotten late. It was much later, always later somehow, in a different house, different life, different people branching out, trees, each one itself. Find your body in the morning sprawled, dog grunted and walked away, sniffing air, feet, what you ate. The other dog ran like ink, ate everyone's shoes. Now they're all barefoot, even in the winter. Lost boys ain't lost because they ain't trying to get nowhere. Planted here, growing, losing leaves, breaking branches, threadbare in the snow. Mud and wood, sky, places that look empty but aren't. That's where I belong, where I won't hurt myself too badly. And if I want to, then no one can stop me. Maybe I'll just dry up and blow away. Maybe that's how I got here, tumbleweed. Like I said, who doesn't love a river? 10 minutes that way and you're back in the woods, aspen, service berries, smell the thunderstorm caught in the mountains. I'm at the bottom of the mountain, but the desert's blowing in. Snow turns pink like it's sweating blood. The entire world blows here eventually. Some things just get caught. We've all slept in the gutter. It makes sense, a dry riverbed, where we can bleed without leaving no stains. Being here, I guess you could call it my last stand, or the world's last stand, just trying to get away from people mostly. Men are men, always will be. Father sits on her shoulder, mud on his boots. Mother was asleep earlier, but she left us alone. Brothers in arm, family in dirt. Visiting with your friend in the mirror who talks too much, has been there a while, a little too long. Just sit here until they know I'm a person. Crawling on all fours up the mountain. This is the spot, bleeding from the knees. This is the place from where you can see it all. And this will make you stay, I hope, in my house with all the antlers and with all the wood and with the fire. Manifest, like most of my projects, took several years to shoot, and then it went into a series of exhibitions. I was eager to turn it into my first book, which took another few years. After a lot of no's, I found a really great publisher in TBW Books who believed in the work and wanted to make it happen. So in 2008, I was able to get this out into the world as my first monograph. The process of making a book is so profoundly clarifying. Ruthless editing is required, and it's a place where the final distillation reveals possible meaning in the work. This book went through numerous iterations before we found its final form. While I was working on the book, my husband and I were contemplating a move to Nashville from New York, and I was also at a juncture where one big project was ending and a new one, or at least the hint of the ideas for one, were beginning to simmer. I made a few trips down south to begin shooting and decided that yes, I was ready to leave New York to immerse myself in a new adventure. So we went all in. We moved south without any jobs. I decided to apply for a Guggenheim Fellowship, and to nobody's surprise more than my own, I was awarded one for the body of work I'm going to show you now. There are a few primary concerns with this project that feel completely related to my prior work, and then there are a few departures. In the most brief sense, I've shifted from the mythology of the American West to that of the American South, arguably something I have a lot more experience navigating. I understand the South, I understand what people perceive of it, and I understand the ways in which its reality is in both a constant state of adhering to those stereotypes and in opposition to them at the same time. What is undeniably true for anybody living here, the history and the mythology of this place play a regular role in our daily lives. This body of work is not entirely complete. 2020 had its way with my production schedule, so there is more to be added, but I'm going to share with you a working edit that is subject to change. The primary architecture for the project is making waterscapes along these bodies of water with violent names in the Southeast. So Murder Creek, Dead Man's Branch, Bloody River, Rape Pond are just a few. The landscape of the southeastern United States is thick with these waters, their names seeming to reflect something fundamental to the settling of the region and its historical knew that would happen, questionably contemporary saturation with violence. I'm traveling all over the Southeast to find these rivers, and honestly, you know, sometimes I'm showing up at rivers, streams, ponds, and sometimes I'm showing up at dried riverbeds or just mud puddles. So there's a lot of failure built into this project. I am hoping to make pictures that are either literally dark, yet descriptive, or are otherwise filled with a kind of uneasiness. I'm shooting primarily in the summer months when the canopy's grown over and shadow plays a significant role in what you can and cannot see. What interests me about these places is not just their beauty, but their perceived danger. It might not take long, in fact, before you begin to hear the banjo from Deliverance in your head. I'm finding ways, once again, to merge something human and the landscape together, like here, where a tree resembles a skeletal rib cage in front of a waterfall cliff where allegedly people have been pushed to their deaths. And that kind of brings me to the second mode of picture making in this project, which is based on my interest in murder ballads. These are songs from the Appalachian tradition that, as the name implies, detail murders. More often than not, these songs detail the murder of a woman at the hands of a man for whatever inconvenience she presented, and quite often her body is submerged in a river or left in the forest. These songs populate the bluegrass and folk traditions of Appalachia and are routinely reinterpreted and performed by contemporary musicians.
This is a real old folk song. This originally came from England, and this sort of tells a tragic story about a guy that loved his girl so well that he beat her to death with a stick and threw her in the river and watched her as she floated down. This one called the Knoxville Girl. I met a little girl in Knoxville, a town we all know well.
All right, for sake of time, I won't play the whole song, but you see lyrically on the side that not only do they kind of joke about this is the Louvin brothers, by the way. Not only do they joke about it at the beginning, the premise of the song, but it goes on in this kind of jaunty way to describe a man murdering a woman and leaving her body in the Knoxville River. My interest in these tunes arose when I began to realize how many of them detail the murder of women at the hands of men, and how often her body is left in a river or, like I said, the forest. Again, it seemed like the landscape bore a particular role in the kind of celebration of violence. It seems surprising somehow to acknowledge this kind of violence in a song, but at least to me it did, but it shouldn't. Our literature, cinema, and definitely our serial television is literally filled with dead girls. Culturally, we seem to love it. So my studio portraits reanimate these drowned women, bringing them back into the world to react to the water and the people who put them there. And I name each of them after these songs. So here, this is actually the very first one I made. This was my bartender in Brooklyn. And we made this portrait in my basement, but I call it the Knoxville Girl. These portraits emphasize for me the imaginative nature of the project overall. Each of the images, not just those that are overtly fictional, is about the omnipresence of myth and memory in nature, our inability to behold a landscape without reading it through cultural codes. In a recent conversation, I've been asked whether this work is taking on some influence from our Me Too era. I guess the answer is yes, although it wasn't intentional. I've never shied away from politics and conversation, and I do believe my work has, in a way, always been political in nature. But I don't do it, or I can't seem to do it in a straight line. I'm going to come at it through metaphor or by using the stories we tell as a jumping off point. The third mode of picture making is maybe the more slippery component of the work, and it's pictures that are made near these bodies of water and in towns and communities that interact with these landscapes. While the language of these pictures is documentary one, much like the landscapes themselves, there is also a cinematic and performative quality that ebbs and flows from picture to picture. I'm really interested in that right now, as a descriptor for the cultural assumptions and who is actually in charge of the story. In general, I'm pushing this work through a spectrum of photographic languages, hoping that by collapsing the boundaries, we really begin to consider the subjectivity of it all. I'm calling this one The Fisherman. The thing about driving around these rural roads and looking for these rivers and streams is that it's utterly impossible to avoid the Gothic South. For the most part, I'm rarely tempted by the ghost town and the dilapidated barn, but every so often I can't resist. The kinds of things on my mind, the kinds of audiobooks I listen to while I drive around, the music, it all kind of intersects in a visual way. This scene stopped me in my tracks, literally. It immediately reminded me of the great Flannery O'Connor short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, in which a band of escaped prisoners led by an outlaw called the Misfit come across a family whose car is run off a rural road into a wooded gulch. The Misfit chats with the grandmother of the family as his buddies lead the others beyond the dark edge of the forest to be killed. Interestingly, and why I bring it up, is that the landscape seems to react to the murders, deriving some kind of satisfaction from the event. Quote, "There was a pistol shot from the woods, followed closely by another, then silence. The old lady's head jerked around. She could hear the wind move through the treetops like a long, satisfied in-suck of breath. Like the landscape needed it." This work has been challenging to produce, long, often fruitless drives with a litany of threats and irritants, from crazy swarms of mosquitoes to snakes to alligators to the ever-present dudes down by the river. I have to navigate them as a single woman. Again, I'm often out of cell phone range, alone, and suddenly in their midst. The South can be terrifying expressly because of the landscape, because you can't see at a far distance, because it's sinewy and dark, and because someone can be just around the bend. It's tested my own fears and assumptions. It's made me more agile and less tethered to heavy things like tripods. And in some cases, my spidey senses have won out, and I've retreated to my car and frankly rage screamed for feeling the need for safety outweighed my desire to make pictures. And I don't think my experience is singular. I believe most women navigate the landscape similarly, especially when alone. I think a lot about why the history of photography is dominated by men, why landscape pictures in particular seem to have largely been in man's domain. And I'm not pretending in any way like I'm a war correspondent or anything. My sense of danger is as much in my imagination as it is a practical reality. But that's exactly what draws me to drive miles and miles down a red dirt road to some place called Murder Creek. And it's what makes me think that there are other ways to look at the traditional landscape, that in the Southern landscape in particular, an embedded and deeply descriptive account is still needed. I'm going to flip through just a few more pictures before wrapping up, trying to stay on time here. This is Murder Creek, very close to where I grew up in central Georgia, a creek that I passed over, I mean, for just ages and ages, that I always kind of imagined stories about. And I would say that's probably the real genesis of this project. Inside the edit, I come to see the water as dangerous and the damp people that I'm photographing as having been probed or marked by it. They wring out their hair, drops pull across their skin like stretch marks, or they look vulnerable and unkempt, rapturous or vengeful. This is actually just outside of Hell-for-Certain, Kentucky, where I got lost and my GPS stopped working, like that moment where it just turns into a blue dot on like on a grid. So I just stopped my car and photographed. What can be most fascinating about photographing water is just how deep or reflective it can be. Never twice the same. It either pulls you in or bounces you back out of the frame. The mystery, of course, is in its unknowableness. Without stepping in it at all, it can turn you completely upside down. Here, thinking about overt violence. Thinking about babies as, you know, I think the generative impulse for a lot of the songs that were written. So women who became pregnant, who shouldn't have, mistresses or whatnot. Here, a crane lifting off of Lynch River. Felt like a little spirit or something. Something gestural here, like inquiring the landscape itself. This is in Defeated, Tennessee, and honestly, some of the places I visited, it wasn't so violent. Sometimes the names were just kind of ominous. Sometimes they were borderline funny. I mean, I think Defeated, Tennessee is borderline funny. But what is interesting here is the kind of cross, and the cross shows up in a lot of pictures. It's as if we know religion is you know, saturates the American South, but it's remarkable how much it seems to appear in pictures you weren't otherwise thinking about that. Poison Cove. I access a lot of these waters over small one-lane bridges, thinking a lot about what it looks like when you look straight down into water, tossed off a bridge, so to speak. Call this one Pretty Polly. This is one of those songs that's been recorded by many, many artists, but most famously by the great Ralph Stanley. Omi Weiss. This is based on Naomi Weiss, whose murder is detailed in a song we know mostly by Doc Watson. Over the summer, well, last summer, not this summer, I spent a lot of time in Asheboro, North Carolina, where her body was found. Making pictures of that, I'm not totally sure about all of them. They're pretty documentary, but I'm compelled to be there. And it is one of the stories, one of the songs that's attached to a very well-known history. And that's not always true for a lot of the songs. The factualness of them is lost to history. This one I've named Delia Green, inspired by the song Delia's Gone, which you might remember from Johnny Cash, among others. I'll mention here that I've created a video installation for this project. So imagine moving through rooms of photos and then you find a door which leads you into a kind of hole in the wall bar or venue. There's this funny MC who's hosting a kind of community open mic night. And it just so happens that each of the performers are men who are singing these songs. So if we have time, I think we have just a couple more minutes. I'll play just a piece of one of those performances. Oops. Oh, I took it out. There we go.
I asked my love to take a walk, just a walk, a little way. And as we walked, then we would talk all about our wedding day.
He goes on to detail murdering this woman and leaving her in the Ohio River. That's a song actually that was first popularized by Olivia Newton-John, of all people, which is kind of its own shade of surprising. I'm going to end here with just a few pictures. As the recipient of the Image Vive Prize out of Switzerland, they really helped me produce this work over the last final year, and mounted a huge exhibition that just came down. It was up all of September in Vevey, Switzerland. I was not able to go because COVID times, but it is remarkable that they still put on the exhibition. Just one note of difference between this and my other work, because of the darkness of these pictures, because I needed that darkness to be super descriptive, I just could not get there with an inkjet print. I tried and tried. So we actually, I turned those digital files back into black and white 4x5 negatives and had them printed as silver print. So these are actually silver gelatin, but just so you get a sense of scale in the installation. All the exhibitions in Vevey they're not in white box gallery or museums, they're outdoors, they're in, different apartments. This was an old steel forge where we mounted this exhibition. I think it looks pretty good for not having been there myself. This is all I have to show for it. But you get a sense of scale, I think, of the pictures. And the time, COVID times. We put the translations from the songs on the back of the wall so that you could be in the space and sort of feel like you were really in a venue, without subtitles, being kind of like a cinema experience. So if you wanted to read, there were French and English translations on the back wall. This is kind of my funny final slide. I'll wrap it up here and just say that there's still some more work to be done. I lost a lot of time this year, as we all did, on certain projects. So I am still shooting and will continue to shoot. And I think there will be a new iteration and hopefully a book by next summer. So we'll see. But that's what I have to share with you today. I'm super happy to stick around and take any questions you may have about the work or whatever else you want to talk about.
Thanks so much, Kristine. That was fantastic. And this is the moment where you should be hearing thunderous applause.
I know, I do. I hear it.
We're sending it your way because that was really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There are some great questions popping up, so I'll get to those in just a second. But before I do, just please, to all of you out there, if you have questions for Kristine, please post them in the Q&A. Like I said, we've got some good ones already, and we'll get right to it. So there's a couple of questions coming in, but I think I'll kind of try to do them chronologically unless it doesn't make sense. And I want to ask a question from actually from a graduate student at Columbia College, who's asking, how did you go about introducing yourself and asking to photograph the men in Manifest? Did you generally photograph right when you met them, or would you arrange another time?
Both, and it really depended on the circumstance. I mean, I've literally pulled my car over and ran up to someone I saw in a field and just tried to make a picture. Of course, they perceive me as a little crazy, but more often, the experience is that I have met someone at a coffee shop, or something. I've kind of scoped someone out. I've talked to them about what I'm doing and can I come over to your place and make a picture? Where do you live, or where do you work? And try to work it out that way. And then typically once I spend time with someone, and I would say almost every time I spend time and make pictures with someone, they'll say, "Oh, you should meet my buddy. I'll give you his number." And then, so that kind of introduces me to people that maybe I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet because they're never in town, or I would have never passed their far corner of that region. And that's more often how it really happened. The way I ended up out there was pretty serendipitous. I was looking for a way west, just generically. I knew I wanted to be west, but I needed to figure out how to get there affordably. And there was this new startup residency in Paonia, Colorado called Elsewhere Studios. Just this sweet little hippie run startup place, and I called them. They didn't even really have a presence, a web presence yet. And I asked if I could come out. And that first time, I think I was out for 5 weeks. I lived there and I met people. There's such a tiny small town, like a 1-block town, but I met people. And that meant that when I came back, I didn't stay at elsewhere anymore. You know, there were other residents there, but I had met people in town so I could rent bedrooms. One summer I slept in a bus. I mean, I would just, whatever I could kind of afford to do, but that always put me adjacent to another social circle also. So I would just let it continue to broaden my connections and people who were willing to let me photograph them. But yeah, I definitely have walked up to someone in a cafe and been like, hey, I'm a photographer. Can I make your picture? And then of course, it's the constant photographer problem where if you say I'm a photographer, they think you're a journalist right away. So you go, no, I'm an artist. But if you say I'm an artist, then you have to like qualify it with, well, I'm actually a photographer. So you got to get that whole like dog and pony show out of the way and then see if they're still with you.
So kind of along that note, and this is a question from me, not from anyone in the audience, but I wonder, you know, thinking about the way you described that in Manifest, how is that similar or different to the work you did with the cadets? I think that was called Gray Line. Is that right?
Yeah, very different.
Yeah.
There's a kind of cooked in obedience at West Point.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. And I was a lot younger when I was making the West Point work too. I mean, I was closer to their age. And that just, and there was something just incredibly safe about all of that. Like I never felt like I was in danger in any way. Making the work for Manifest was quite different. There was no, there were no boundaries that I could rely on. So I had to, you know, trust my instincts and hope that I was not getting myself into perilous situations. Mm-hmm. But totally different. I mean, yeah, these almost all these guys have weapons in their cars, and you know, I mean, there's mountain lions, you know.
Right. So. Well, and that I think brings us to a comment that a viewer made, and I'll try to kind of form it into a question because I think it's an interesting comment. So the viewers asking or sort of suggesting this comment about how your work taps into the collective unconscious of women and the notion of violence towards women, which reminds me of something that I read about how generational violence can in fact encode itself in our DNA. And so I wonder if I'm doing a bad job of making this into a question. So maybe I'll just say, what do you think of that? I don't know how to make it into a question, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I do. I was asked in an interview, this must be a couple years ago now, when I was first starting Dark Waters, which to me felt like a real departure in terms of like some stylistic choices, but also just really moving into like studio portraits, things that felt very conceptual. But they said, do you think your work is always been about violence? And I just went, yeah. And then I got very uncomfortable with that answer. No, it's about people. Mm. Wait, is it about, you know, it was like one of those moments where the interviewer knows more about me than I know about me, which is very common, by the way. But yeah, I do think my discomfort with the military, my need to humanize something that I understood as managing violence was really like a compulsion for that work. I mean, there's a deep respect that I have, but I think I also needed to like soften the threat in a way. And then Manifest was really, I mean, confronting the potential head on. It was thinking about the landscape and the potential for danger. And it was thinking about man's relationship to that. But in retrospect, as I'm in Dark Waters work, where I'm very specifically talking about the threat to women, yeah, maybe I was really thinking about that in Manifest too. Like maybe now I really am just focusing on the female story instead of on the men's story.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it sort of, there's another question about if you see your work in conversation with someone like Robert Adams, and I think like the way that you've talked both in your lecture and in some of these responses, it is interesting to me how differently you have looked at the West and at that sort of manifest destiny compared to someone like Adams, right? Who's looking at it purely, well, I won't say purely, but primarily from a standpoint of the land itself, and you're thinking about that from a different standpoint. And so I wonder if somebody like Adams or other sort of quintessential men with cameras who have imaged the West, if that enters your thinking as you're imaging these places from a distinctly different point of view.
I mean, I do think about the history, I do think about what's my contribution. I mean, I think, look, I'm a teacher too. I think all kinds of projects are valid, and I encourage photographic exploration in every way. But for me, I want to make a contribution that feels like it hasn't been made yet. And so for me, when I was out West and I was thinking about, I mean, I love those O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins pictures. I mean, I devour them. They're beautiful. I don't have anything else to say about that.
Right.
I certainly don't have anything better to say about that. That's for sure. So if my experience was disoriented, and it was just lightheaded and slipping down cliffs, not wearing the right shoes, dropping camera, all of that, all part of the comedy of Kristine photographing. Could I make pictures that described that? How I felt. I didn't stand in front of that landscape and think how grandiose it's all for me. I thought, wow, this is intense, so.
Yeah, I have like 20 more questions I want to ask you about that, but I also want to let other people ask questions. So let's see, where are we? So there's a question regarding the Dark Waters series, and if the studio portraits of women are at times paired with an image of a body of water. And then also this question also asks how the body of work is sequenced.
Well, I haven't put a book together yet. And honestly, I'm having a hard time conceptualizing it. Manifest felt easier to stitch together. I hope that the pictures I shared of the installation demystified a little. I do mix all the pictures together. I am finding the moments where this picture next to this picture do something, that space in between two pictures that kind of creates new meaning. I am beginning to find those. I think that requires just a lot of shifting pictures around on a table and sequencing to figure that out. So no definite sequence yet, no definite pairs yet, but they're talking to each other, definitely. And I hope to make more. I mean, I have tons of those portraits, but I have ideas for more before this is really complete.
So I'm going to ask another question of mine, and I'm curious, as you've shown us 3 distinct bodies of work in this lecture, and they clearly have, they have threads and themes that cross over constantly, right? There's a lot of ideas that move across all of your work. And so I wonder, as you have, been doing this long enough where you are starting to generate like finished bodies of work or finished series, like how you as an artist and maker think about past work as you're making new work, and then even looking maybe out into the future, how, if you would like to see all of this work together at some point, either in book form or exhibition form, and just kind of how you think through, that process of finishing a project and starting a new one that has such ties to the previous work.
I mean, I'm a pretty tunnel visioned worker. I know people, I know photographers who can work on various really diverse projects, and they seem so much more productive than me that way. In that way, I get just really tunnel visioned in, and it takes me a while. If I'm totally honest with you, it takes me a while to really simmer on ideas and really think about the edit. So I certainly do think about what I've done before, and I hope I'm always like kind of pushing myself further. I mean, I think this new work, employing different kind of languages, using the video installation, sound, like suddenly there's all these other elements that feel like, okay, that's another step. I don't know what comes after this right now because I'm still sort of finishing this and thinking about a book. But in some ways I feel glad to see the thread, but I don't feel like I have to put that burden on myself either. And I just, as much as I can kick down kind of the rules and the boundaries, I just am an incredibly instinctual person. So who knows what comes next? But I mean, certainly all these ideas are clearly ones that you know, have interested me and continue to interest me and probably will continue, but I can't say for sure. And I don't feel too hemmed in by that either. Like I didn't show Nashville Nights tonight, you know, like this much more kind of carefree body of work that I make in these honky tonks around Nashville. I mean, for me, that's like the kind of the pressure release. Mm-hmm. It's just like the thing I do when in normal times we're out listening to music and I'm just thinking about fashion and culture. And I like to engage myself in like little mini projects like that as well that don't feel so I don't know, heavy.
Sure. And I mean, I think that actually, like, there are a couple of questions that are directly related to the sort of technical side of your practice. And I really like, to me, it kind of reminded me when you were talking, what you just said reminded me of the point in your lecture where you were talking about like how at one point you decided that there really isn't a difference between the cameras that you use, or at least they don't dictate the kind of picture that you have to make. And
they don't dictate the seriousness of the picture or the quality. I do think they bear effect on, you know, the experience of photographing and certainly the way space is described. I can acknowledge that, but I had these rules for myself that the 4x5 was my artist camera and the DSLR was like my whatever. And I don't have room for those rules anymore. They're not helpful. And there's no reason to go back and make the picture with the 4x5 that you already made perfectly well with the other camera. So yeah. And that was just a moment for me to sort of unplug some of that grad school programming. I think gets like, you know, you get hardwired into thinking certain ways. And yeah, you just, after a couple years of therapy, you can let go of that.
Right, exactly. Well, and like, you know, for me, this idea, like, I think especially now with cell phone cameras and, you know, I have, you know, I think that the iPhone should be called the iCamera because the only update is to the camera. And
totally.
And so sometimes it feels like, well, since every single human that I interact with has a pretty great camera in their pocket, I somehow have to use a better camera than they do. And I think that that's asinine.
Yeah.
But I, you know, to honor these two questions, I do wonder if you would be so generous as to talk a little bit more about your approach. There's a person who wants to know specifically what kind of view camera you use. There's another question regarding how you edit your images. I think specifically like not edit them down to a body of work, but specifically within a single image, and your use of black and white. So if you have any thoughts on those things that you feel like you can share.
I use a Wista 4x5, and I mostly just use a 135 Schneider lens on it. And that's been my baby since grad school. I love the camera. It does have a viewfinder on the top, but I don't really use that. You know, I treat it like a regular 4x5. I put the sheet over my head and compose everything that way. And then otherwise I'm standing beside the camera. I did pick up an 8x10 like a year and a half ago. And that's just proven to be an incredibly cumbersome transition from 4x5 to 8x10. And I got into a couple situations where I hauled the 8x10 and all the gear down by a river, and I was under the sheet and I was fussing around. I mean, it's just very physical. My arms are completely extended, trying to focus. And from up the cliff in the bushes somewhere, I heard, "I saw you here yesterday. You sure like to take pictures." And I got out from under the sheet and I turned around and I can't see anyone, but you know what? I was here yesterday making pictures, which means you were here wherever you are, you know? And so I just was like, I am not dragging an 8x10 out here by myself anymore. This is like, I'm not going to leave it here. I really feel like I need to get moving right now and not stick around. And I just was like, all right, new rule for Kristine: do not carry 50 pounds of gear by yourself down by the river, because there's that weird, you know, potential for interactions that you're not totally prepared for. So, and maybe also don't go to the same place twice.
Yeah.
Maybe that's another rule. Anyways, I digress. How do I edit my pictures? Well, if I'm scanning film, you know, I'm mostly making Imacon scans because that's what I have access to. And then I immediately am working on that translation from color to black and white, which I do with the black and white filter in Photoshop. Like ever since they created that filter that lets you grab like 9 different spectra, you know, magenta, yellow, green, all of them. What a miraculous tool. And I'm, you know, I'm kind of like stonery staring at, like, it's remarkable to me how much time I can spend looking at those different translations and just sort of appreciating how the space really changes. So that's just a process thing for me. I actually like printing. I'm one of the people who printed for other artists for years. So I still really want to be the person who prints and engages in that translation myself. So a lot of Photoshop work. And then typically I have just made inkjet prints in my own studio. But like I said, for Dark Waters, it's so ridiculous. Shoot on film, process, scan, digitally turn into black and white, and then turn back into a black and white 4x5 negative, and then print it in a darkroom. I'm fully aware of how insane that sounds.
I love it. I think it's amazing. It's like,
but they look glorious.
It's going around the block to get next door, but you got there.
And you have so much control. You have so much control. And then get this, when you get into the dark room, boom, you don't have to fuss around with burning and dodging. You already did all of that. It's just once you find the time and the right contrast for how you're making those negatives, you can just make those prints. So I love it. They look really beautiful. So I know it's kind of a bananas workflow, but I think at the beginning when I was shooting color film and scanning it and turning black and white, before we had digital raw files, I was already doing that. And people were like, that's crazy. Why not just shoot on black and white film? And I said, well, I'll tell you. So I'm used to just, you know, I'm used to doing it the hard way, but I do it on purpose. And that's for more control. Yeah. Great. I hope I answered your question. I don't know what else to say about Photoshop. I spend a lot of time on it. And I look at a lot of different, I don't think there's like one translation that's right. I look at a lot of translations and think about how they feel. Yeah.
So unless more pop in while I'm asking this one, this is the last question. And it's from Jesse Brown, who's asking about your Dark Waters series, and they're making an observation that there seems to be almost a film still quality, and which references to this person movies like Night of the Hunter. And they are wondering with that along with literature and music, if you look at film as reference, and if so, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. You know, there's no one film I can point you towards to say that's what was in my mind. However, the totality of the description of the South, both in cinema and serial television, is in my mind. And the ways in which those stories even prime me when I walk out into the landscape by myself. And this is kind of what I was saying about, okay, so I've had interactions with people which could have gone south. See, I made the pun. I did it. But there's other times when I have that potential built up in me because I've seen so many movies, because I've seen, read the stories. And so I think that part of what I'm trying to talk about is just how our stories kind of prime us or our expectations when we're in a place. And I guess the other side of that coin is how much of the history of that place primes us for our cultural output. You know, how much of, you know, holding on to the names of, you know, Murder Creek or Bloody River. And at the beginning, I really was diligently trying to find the provenance of all these names until I realized most of it's lost to folklore. I would find the same story attached to two different rivers, like one in North Carolina and one in Mississippi. And I'm just like, yeah, we don't really know, but we like to call it this. Like we like to think about the bloodshed here. And so I think about both sides of that coin. And I do, you know, as much as I'm very overtly referencing music, yeah, some of these pictures, even out by the water, are performative. I've hired actors in some cases, like the men fighting. I didn't just happen upon them. Those are stuntmen, actually. So, you know, also thinking about how I can interact with that lineage of storytelling to make pictures. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good observation. I will say that before I started this work, I don't know if anyone has seen that Netflix series called Bloodline. It takes place in like the Florida Keys. Very dark story. Very dark story, like literally, but also the cinematography is incredibly dark. And it was the one thing I was watching right before I made my first trip down south. And I kept testing myself. How late at night do I feel safe to be out here alone and still making pictures? Like, how dark can I really shoot and still be able to describe something photographically, you know, without all the cinema lights that help you make that kind of exposure that you can get in cinema? How do you do it in a still photo without all of that? I was really trying to test the boundaries. And that's also when I realized digital was such a great tool, because it can simply describe more darkness than film can. So I was interested in that as, again, a contribution, because I mean, look, we've got Sally Mann. We've got some like incredible contributions to Southern photography. I found out about Dawood Bey's work halfway into the project he was doing with the Underground Railroad. I saw that about halfway through working on this, and I was just blown away. Like, yes, exactly. Look how richly you can describe nighttime, and how we haven't been able to do that yet. Now, I don't know him, and I haven't had this conversation, but you know, I'm sure. Is he here?
Yes.
Dawood, I'm such a huge fan, and you have no idea. I'm so glad I didn't know you were in here when I started this talk.
Sorry for telling you.
Yeah, no. But I would love to know what camera that was, because when I saw that, I was like, it has to be digital. We can't do that on film. They're so incredibly descriptive. So yeah, another juncture, I think, where I was in some of those pictures really willing to step away from the 4x5 and use a camera that is going to allow me to describe that darkness with more specificity. Yeah.
Well, I think that's we don't have any more questions that have come in, so I think that's a great place to end. And I just want to say thank you, Kristine. This was fantastic. It was great to have you. I want to thank our audience for joining us. Before we get to the thunderous applause for Kristine, I want to remind everybody that Mimi Plum will be joining us on December 2nd at 6 o'clock. So
she's wonderful. She's so wonderful, and that works brilliant. I'm happy that you guys have her coming.
We're all really excited. So hopefully, again, everybody, you can join us for that. Tell your friends. And now, again, Kristine, thank you so much. This is the weird part of the digital world where everyone just disappears, but I know intrinsically that they're all clapping for you. So thank you so much. What a great lecture, and it's been a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you guys so much. Have a great evening. Bye.
So long.